statement that this was the epicenter of the Scots-Irish immigration from 1720 to 1780. Why did they come here? Because everything on the other side of the river was taken. Who was over here? The French and the Indians. They pushed them back. And they came right down the Great Valley, Carlisle, Shippensburg, Chambersburg, all the way down into the Shenandoah. That's all Scots-Irish culture.
Carolinas, actually.
Yeah. And mostly 90% were Presbyterians. So all the Presbyterian churches. Okay. So that Scotch-Irish culture is still strong. And we don't even think about it. But there are a couple of things. Here's an example of it. The custom of carrying a bride across the threshold. That's a Scots-Irish custom. And it used to be weddings, they would have a thing called kidnapping the bride. It was a charade that was played out. The guys, the ushers, okay, they would go get liquored up one night and then go to the bride's house and demand that the bride come out, and the father was going to defend her honor. It's all pantomime, it's all a play. And the last part of the play was that the groom goes in and grabs the girl and goes out of the house, and takes her to her house. Now, the vestige of carrying the bride over the threshold comes from that Celtic Scots-Irish custom of kidnapping the bride. The kidnapping part they now do is, going to some place in Las Vegas. Okay, that's what they do now. But the old deal, that was the old deal. Okay, so there's a lot of customs like that come through. And I said to Cheryl, one of the things that I invite you to do in the next weeks that you're doing this is when you get into church on Sunday and you start, identifying some of these threads, all of a sudden listen to the Book of Common Prayer and you're going to say, oh my, I've been saying that all these years, oh my, I know where it comes from. Listen to the way Corinda preaches, because all Episcopal preachers, Anglican preachers are going to be preaching with a certain kind of a theme. I'll be talking about that theme. And all of a sudden, if you're listening for it, you'll say, oh yeah, I know where I'm at, okay? So it's very interesting to pull that apart. There was a picture of Michael Curry up here. Now, there's another wonderful thread that's come into our church, and now it's very strong, the African-American thread. And that's a different kind of a thing that comes in together. Okay. This is the statue of St. Aidan. I'm going to get to Aidan in a bit. But it certainly gives you a perspective, first of all, of a cross. That cross is called the Celtic cross. Incidentally, we usually use the word with hard C as opposed to the Boston Celtics. That's the basketball team, spelled the same way. But you'll find that most people now are pronouncing this with the hard C, the Celt. Which comes from a Greek word meaning other, the others. It was a disparaging term that was used by the Greeks and taken over by the Romans. Talk about the barbarian people, the other people. But in order to get into this, let me start with this picture. Can anybody identify what that is? It's hard to see,
It's always that Princess Diana was
exactly
killed.
That's Kensington Palace. And that is a sea of flowers that were collected when she was killed and deposited in front of the gate where she lived. I did the Celtic seminar only 2 years later over there, and they still couldn't get over, the Church of England people couldn't get over what had happened. Every place throughout the United Kingdom, every cathedral, this is what happened. People came and deposited flowers. Now you'll see that today when you saw it 9/11, you'll see it with pictures, you'll see candles, you'll see a child who was killed in a car accident, there's a teddy bear. And to me, this picture is so deeply moving because it shows, I think, the struggle that we're having in our moment to deal with so many of the issues of eternity. How do you deal with death, especially in a culture that no longer goes to church? Nobody's going to church. Well, very few people going to church in Europe, and we have a absolutely, decline here in terms of church culture in this country. It's collapsing. And yet, when there is a time that when something happens, this is the kind of thing that we've got. People trying to make some sense of it. And that brings me to the Celtic experience. William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, he was a Protestant, Irishman, great poet of the early 20th century. He lived born in 1880s and died in the 1930s. And Yeats coined a term, the Celtic twilight. He wrote a book, actually, Celtic twilight. Now, twilight, you know, is that time, it can be either in the morning or the evening, when the horizon fills because the sun is appearing or disappearing, and there's that moment where the light sort of diffuses. It's interesting that that's the movies about the girls, what's that, the Celtic, that's called Twilight movies too, you know, the vampire movies, okay. And it's always mystical, it's a mystical time, okay. So Bates, W.B. Yeats, Y-E-A-T-S, talks about this mystical experience. You know, so what hopefully this experience for you will be to try to touch base with the mysticism that comes from the Celtic tradition. But it's not just a sort of a fairy tale thing, it is a very solid thing. I'll talk about that aspect as well. And I'll come back to that picture a little bit later. It was at that point that Yeats actually was spearheading, with a number of others, a revival. There have been at least 5 revivals over the course of 1,500 years of interest and fascination in Celtic things. Speaking about that, can you see that picture? So you have a piper and you have 2 guys looking up the kilt, and they're giggling. We have this fascination for this Celtic culture, and a lot of it says, a lot of people think, oh, that's kilts and Scots, and that's part of it. That's only 1/6 of it. 1/6 of it is Scottish and Gaelic. The language that's spoken in the Highlands is Gaelic, as opposed to Irish, which is Gaelic. They're related. I'll talk about it in a second. But yeah, we have a fascination with this. So there it is, what's under the kilt. I won't go into more details than that. And we have things like Braveheart, which is tremendously romanticized, this whole thing. That movie was full of all kinds of errors. And some of it were sort of comical. Like even bagpipes. You're listening, you're seeing pictures of somebody playing Highland full bagpipes, but you're listening to the music of Irish eland pipes, which you don't blow until you bellow. That's like seeing somebody playing a trumpet, but actually you're hearing a clarinet play. So for pipers, we're thinking, what's this? Okay? Or remember how he put blue paint on his face? Well, yeah, okay, the Celtic people 1,200 years before, during the revolt of Boudica, put blue paint on, but he didn't wear it. He wore knight's armor. This was a medieval thing. So a lot of it is anachronistic. You know, the French princess, well, when Wallace was executed, she was 2 years old. He wasn't hopping into bed with her like Hollywood has, okay? But what I'm saying is that this thing has tremendously inspired people. As a matter of fact, a lot of people think that the whole Braveheart movie and saga pushed the people in Scotland to have their own parliament, and almost in a vote a couple of years ago, almost to leave the United Kingdom. It was that close. And then, of course, we have things like river dance. People are fascinated with Celtic festivals. Here's the Irish dancing, the different kinds of dancing. Irish dancing is different than the Highland Scottish dancing. Highland Scottish dancing is a lot of hopping like this. The Irish dancing is straight up like this. So it's a different style of doing things. So the whole culture, there was a time when you didn't hear bagpipes very much. The first time I piped publicly for an event was right here at this church. It was a wedding. And they wanted a piper, and I remember piping in the church and piping outside the church. That goes back in the 1987, 88, something like that. And now pipers are routinely used, and used for all kinds of things in this country, especially sorrowful things. We, after 9/11, a lot of piping for those kind of occasions. But what brings us into the culture, I think, in a special way, is not the piping and not the kilts and all that stuff. There is a deeply rich spiritual component. My hope is that in your conversations as you read this book, that you will begin to feel that pull of that culture. It's hard to do by reading a book. The best way, of course, is to get on the ground and experience some of the place, or experience some of the people. But I hope that this will begin to do that, and maybe it'll open the door that you will want to do some, if you haven't traveled, maybe want to travel or do some things that will speak to us. Now, let me start talking about Celtic things by saying what it's not. The Celts are not a strain of peoples. Celts actually is a term we use for language. And there are 6 surviving Celtic languages that are still spoken. And all of them, we were mentioning this before, are a challenge. It'll be hard to read that for you, but the first I have on this slide, the dilemma of pronunciation, is the Gaelic, the Irish Gaelic word, okay, Solancha. We pronounce it Solancha, but it's spelled Slainte. Looks like Sant or something like that. But if you're in a bar and if you're having a Guinness, you say Solancha, Solancha Gader. Much health to you, okay? The Highland Gaelic is pronounced differently, and it's written. It's Slante, and we usually say Solanja, Solanjavar. So if we're toasting with Scotch, Solanjavar, okay, and it means health to you in Highland Gaelic, okay. Another example. New Year's, Celtic New Year's, is the 1st of November, and that's where we get, of course, All Saints. Halloween is All Hallows, in the Old English way, Eve, All Hallows Eve. The tradition, our Halloween is nothing but Celtic New Year. The Celts believed that there was a thin membrane between the old year and the new year, and that membrane where the spirits would wander was on the night of the 31st of October into the 1st of November. And Christians came along and says, okay, we're not going to fight this. Everybody's having a good time. We're going to baptize it, and we're going to, ancestors, okay, 1st November is All Saints Day. It's arbitrary. The only reason we have an All Saints Day is because it was a Celtic New Year Day, and they took over the tradition. Now, in the Celtic tradition, it's called Samhain. Samhain. But it's spelled Samhain. Okay? And then one more. Corinda, we were over last time when our Irish guy was teaching us to do Peace Be With You. Okay? And he taught us that, and it's pronounced Shiagon Lent, or for a large people, or for one person, Shiagon Lieve. Okay? That's how you say peace be with you. Okay? I'm learning right now a lot of Welsh terms, which is Podbeneth. Podbeneth means many blessings in Welsh. And that's a way that many people greet each other. So what I'm trying to explain to you is that it's very, very hard to pronounce these languages because it doesn't seem like they're written the way they should sound. And that's because they didn't come into a written form until about the 6th or 7th century. There was an oral language. There are 6 surviving Celtic languages that are spoken, and they're in 2 groups. The first group is called Q Celtic, and this is represented by the Irish Gaelic, by the Highland Scots Gaelic, and by the dialect spoken on the Isle of Man called Mansk. And they're related. But the other three, the Q sound vanishes and the P sound takes its place. And that are the languages of Welsh, the Welsh language, which is Old Briton language, the dialect in Cornwall, the Cornish language. Cornwall is down on the far southwestern corner of England. Okay, if you've watched Poldark, that's all Cornwall. Truro is the great city in that area. And do you remember the heroine's name?
And Plymouth is where the Pilgrims sailed
That's
from.
right. That's right. Do you remember the heroine's name? Demalja. That's a Celtic name. Okay. She has red hair. Oh yeah, I'll talk about the red hair later. So what I'm saying is that whole region, what are they doing? They're mining tin. That's a Celtic region with their own language, the Cornish language. Okay. And if you go across the Celtic Sea to northern France, down from Normandy, where the invasion took place, to Brittany, you'll get to Britain, and that's a Celtic region. They have a Celtic, they don't speak French all the time, they speak Celtic Breton. They have their own bagpipes that they blow, similar to the Highland pipes, but different. Those are the Celtic regions, and when I look at a map someplace, I'll show you the map later, you can see that all these groups have been pushed out to the extremes, out to the coastline, up in the mountains, out in the islands. Okay? The other thing we identify with Celtic people is a particular artistic, cultural kind of identity. And one of the things you can see, for instance, is the Celtic knot. If you look at any of the, I'll talk about these cultural time periods in just a moment, but if you look at the Celtic knot or any kind of the Celtic way of doing things artistically, you'll find all this intricacy, always in a larger, simple kind of symbol. So it's a big, big symbol, and then within it, all kinds of intricacy. I'm going to demonstrate how that works on music. Celtic, these are my electronic bagpipes. I didn't bring the other ones. Celtic music has two signatures to it. The first signature is the droning sound. On pipes, we have three drones, a bass and two tenors, and there are reeds in there, and they're playing like a chord. But then, to play the music, because the pipes, unlike a normal wind instrument, I can tongue the notes, attack it with my tongue, trumpet, clarinet, okay? And that will make the sound distinct. I can blow harder, and that can make the sound distinct. The bagpipes, I have one volume loud, okay? I can't change the volume. And I can't stop the air, because the air is flowing through the last pipe that I'm playing, okay? So we play grace notes and embellishments. Even singers, you'll hear that. It's not amazing, it's amazing grace, how sweet. Listen to Appalachian music. You'll hear all the singings come through. Let me just play something for you. I'll do Amazing Grace. Listen to the little notes. Can you hear the little notes? So, you hear that, and it's common in the Celtic culture to have this big picture, little picture, okay? And you'll see it in the art, you'll see it in the art, you'll see it in the music. There are two cultural periods that historians have identified for Celtic peoples, and again, who are the Celtic peoples, but the people who speak the language. And we're talking about the era that basically corresponds to the latter part of the monarchies in the Bible, the divided kingdoms of Israel. It's the early Iron Age. The Bronze Age has gone by. Early Iron Age. And so the first, they take their names after two towns or settlements in Europe. Hallstatt is in Austria. And they've dug up a whole village in Austria at Hallstatt. And they've identified this culture between the 7th and the 5th centuries before Christ. Then in Switzerland, at the little town of Latane, they dug up in the 4th century other massive artifacts. It's the Latane culture which has become the defining Celtic artistic culture, and I'll show you that in the Book of Kells in a bit. We see a picture of what that Celtic artwork looks like. Those are the two cultural periods. And what's happening over in Europe at this time? Roman Empire is taking over, pushing everybody back. You have the German Teutonic tribes coming in, pushing people west. So the Celtic tribes who are speaking these languages all begin to move west and north. So Caesar is after Vercingetorix, and that's in France and Gauls, and he defeats the Gauls in 54 BC, something like that, and takes over. And then another 2 generations, the Roman Empire pushes over the English Channel and comes into what we now call England. Okay, so all that's happening, and what's happening to the peoples before them, are all moving. And so these Celtic tribes are moving north and west. Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, islands, highlands, wherever they're moving away from. Okay, that's all happening. But there are people already living there. Who's living there at the point? Well, the Neolithic people. Neolithic people, the people who do the great stone circles. That's not Celtic at all. Stonehenge is before Abraham. It goes back 3,000 years before Christ. Okay, but this idea of the circles is something that is something that ancient peoples take on, and then the Celtic people embrace. So the ideas of wreaths and circling, and there are Celtic traditions, very much like Native American traditions, of honoring the 4 corners, north, south, east, and west. And so you have that happening here. And you have the passage tombs in Ireland and some in Scotland. You have, this is a crannog. A crannog is a thatched farm with a palisade enclosure, usually on an island. There were no cities or towns. This was all very rural culture, and it was organized in the primitive way with family relationships and tribal relationships, or as it comes to be called, clans. So that there was a clan chief who basically presides over a number of families related to that group, and that's how they organize themselves.
So these are the people that were there.
Yes, the Neolithic people are already there. The Celtic people come in, and now they're all speaking Celtic languages. The Neolithic languages have gone away, and the Celtic languages are now being spoken. In the same way that when the Germans come in and they bring the English language, the Celtic languages disappear, and we're all speaking English today and not speaking Gaelic. Another feature of this tradition, you can see the scroll work in the bottom of the tree, is the tree. The word druid, people very confused about druids. They think they're witch doctors. Druids were the learned sages of Celtic culture. Because it's a oral culture, nothing is written down, everything is memorized. And Druids went through a period of 20-some years memorizing stuff. The word Druid means oak tree. So they were solid as oak. And Celtic peoples have always had an affinity for springs of water and trees. And you'll see Esther DeWall will talk a lot about nature and creation. And you'll see how she ties this in, this idea of embracing culture and nature. And of course, we associate them with these places that are remote and far off. This map, and it's hard for you to see, I realize, but it can give you a sense of the Celtic regions, which of course this is north of England and Scotland, and this is Ireland, okay? And the Isle of Man is right there in the middle, Mansk, okay? So you have the different language, Gaelic, Gallic, Mansk. Here is Wales. This is where Bangor is right here, okay? And Carnarvon, this is where the British when the new king becomes the king, when Queen Elizabeth passes away, there's going to be a grand ceremony to make Charles the king, but then there's going to be a grand ceremony. They're going to take William, and they're going to take him to Carnarvon Castle, and they're going to make him the Prince of Wales. As his father is now the Prince of Wales is always the successor to the British throne. Well, that's right in Carnarvon, right here. And then if you go down further here, you're in Cornwall, and across the Celtic Sea, you're into Brittany. Those are the Celtic regions. Well, I have a feeling you'll read a lot about St. Patrick, which is a very important story to begin to sort of put together and right center into the historical development of this. I want to take this now in a linear way and talk historically how this happens. Patrick is born in 271. He dies in 361. He is born down here somewhere in the British Isles to a Christian family. But the story he tells, and it's a wonderful story because we have it, it survives in his so-called confessions, is that he gets kidnapped by Irish pirates. He's out here watching the herds for his family, and as a young man of about 14, he gets kidnapped and taken to Ireland. And he lives there in captivity as a sheep herder for 7 or 8 years until he hears this voice telling him to leave. And he, on his own, a perilous journey, comes all the way across Ireland, finds somehow passage on a boat, and gets out of there. And eventually, that whole experience of conversion brings him very, very close to the Christian faith that he had known as a child. I think his father was a deacon, but he had never, like young people, never really embraced it for himself. And when he's out in the middle of nowhere over their 7 or 8 years with the sheep, and he's builds this kind of relationship with God. He goes back to Europe and takes training to become a priest, and he's ordained a priest. And 15 years later, they send him back to Ireland to be the Bishop of Ireland. And Ireland at that point was pagan. It was divided into four. There he is. There's Patrick. Do you recognize that statue? That's the one that's on Slain. Yep. Yeah. Ireland was divided at that point into, like all over Europe. Germany was the same way until late in the 19th century. All these municipalities was one big country. There were 4 quadrants in what is now Ireland, and there were 4 high kings, and then lower kings. And so Patrick came into this pagan area, and in the most astounding example of Christian missionary activity, bar none, within a generation, almost the whole of Ireland was converted to Christianity, and not one person was killed. It's an astounding feat, and the Irish are still very, very proud of it, and Ireland remains one of the most active Christian nations in Europe, along with Poland. Primarily because in the last century or so, both of those countries suffered persecution, and so their religion became very important to them as a way to continue. We think of Patrick because of, we think of shamrocks and 3, leaves with 3, and he used existing Irish symbols, especially the symbol of the triangle, to try to convey the Trinity. And so this whole Trinitarian thing became very important. You'll read about some of that. The Celtic Church was noted for 2 things. This new form of Christianity that had come to Ireland. First of all, it was known because of the settlements. That for the first time they started to put together stone structures, small huts really, some of them still exist, but more notably the high crosses. And what we call the Celtic cross, of course, was the standard Latin cross with a great circle in it. Okay? And a lot of people wonder, how did that develop? Well, the circle is the universal symbol of the sun. Most Celtic people worshipped the sun god called Lugh. They worship nature. I'll talk about worshiping nature. So it's most primitive people worship the sun. That was cultural. So what they basically had done was they took before there was a cross, sometimes there would be a pillar with a circle on it. So they put the cross in the middle of the circle. I like to say they took the symbol of the atonement, Good Friday, the cross, and put the symbol of Easter on top of it, the circle. So when we look at the Celtic cross, what I see is Good Friday and Easter together. Now, you'll notice our Presbyterian friends love that cross, and I would imagine in Trinity there must be a good many Celtic crosses. I know in St. John's there's Celtic crosses everywhere. It's a very common cross that's used by Anglicans, and you'll see it very frequently. Do you have any Celtic crosses?
We just got a brand new one.
You do?
Judah.
You know?
It's outside.
By the time of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, these high crosses became masterful pieces of art. We saw some that were as much as 18 to 20 feet high. That would be as high as this room. Massive things. And this is the cross of the scripture at Clonmacnoise, which is one of the restored Irish monastic settlements. And it's called the cross of the scripture because on all four sides there are panels, and carved into those panels are stories from the Bible. And on one side is the suffering Christ, crucifix. On the other side is the Christ in glory, Christus Rex. And at the very top, Cheryl, capstone is St. Paul of Thebes and Anthony of the Desert. Now these are two North African desert hermit saints. And you think, now what? Well, the Irish and the Scots, why did they put that at the top of their cross? Because the spirituality of the desert was the same spirituality as in the middle of nowhere, up on an island or the highlands. They revered these desert spiritual leaders, and therefore they gave them always the honored place, you can't see it very well, carved into the top of these big Celtic crosses are Paul of Thebes and Anthony of the Desert. They also established monastic communities, and when I say monastic, you've got to sort of wipe clean your concept of Benedictine stuff, okay? Benedict, who also comes from about this time, is that person who was the dynamic force in the establishment of Western monasticism. Benedict, especially known for breaking things down and organizing things in a timetable. And many of our religious orders are Benedictine. This is the cross of the Associates Cross of Holy Cross, which is our largest Episcopal church Benedictine order for men. And I'm an associate of Holy Cross. And it's Benedictine. It's very structured. Celtic spirituality was very different. First of all, Celtic nuns and monks were not required to do celibacy. Some lived in families. Some took on celibacy. It was something to be chosen, not something you're required to do. And you can see that has followed after the Reformation, certainly in the tradition of Anglican clergy marrying or not marrying if they wished. It was not an enclave of monastic to get away from people. There were some of them, and we certainly that were in remote places. We'll talk about the two great ones. But there were lots of places like here's one is Clonmacnoise on the right, and the other one is that's Lindisfarne, where actually people came and they formed communities. The first communities that were formed, they came and they formed communities around this monastic settlement. The heart of it, of course, was the constant prayer and religion at various times of the day. But that was another key feature of Celtic Christianity. I should say that the course that I teach for the Stevenson School, the regular course is a 10-week academic course. And It's called Recovering and Claiming Celtic Spirituality. And I've done that for a number of years, but then as I talk to people, they say, I wish we could get people in our congregation to hear some of this. So what I've done, I've developed, this is the 5th time I've done this in a congregation, an opportunity to come and just read one book, not a couple, and you don't have to write papers and do all that kind of stuff for me. But it's an opportunity to sort of touch base. Now, if you find yourself, this is a great experience, I'd like to do more. I'm not sure when we're going to run the full course, maybe next spring I'll run it again. But you could sign up and do the full course in Celtic spirituality, which I do. The primary book that I do for that course is Ian Bradley's The Celtic Way. There's a number of, I didn't see you had a copy of that printed out. I didn't bring that either, but it's a wonderful book, excellent. And then the one we're using is Every Earthly Blessing. So the book that you have, I hope you will enjoy. It is not, Ian Bradley is much more linear historical. This one is much more thematic. But I think you'll find that Esther DeWall has a lovely writing style. And I guess I'm using them all to prop up. Esther DeWall's under here someplace.
Here's
one.
There it is, okay. And I see that you've laid this out so that you have a schedule for reading. You're going to be meeting 5 more times. I guess it's about every other week. And the idea is that, you will be able during the 2 weeks to read a chapter of the book. And as you read the chapter of the book, read it slowly, go back, underline it, and then when you come together, I will have some suggested discussion things you can go for. But you don't have to do what I'm suggesting. Do whatever, what hit you this week? What was excited you? What troubled you? Whatever it is, and talk about that. And as I say, I'll also suggest a couple of the exercises in Celtic spirituality you can talk about and begin to think about that one too. Okay. There's the Celtic twilight. It's now 10 minutes after 2. Okay, something like that. How long do we have? 20 more minutes? You go to 2:30. Is that what you're planning on doing?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe I'll run through things quickly. This is the statue of St. Aidan on Lindisfarne, which is up in the North Umbrian coastline on the northeast side of England, just below Scotland, where Scotland is. And this was one of the 2 holy islands of the Celts. We'll talk about how that came to be. But as I do that, I'd like to sort of begin to suggest to you what I call the core values of the Christian movement. Of the Celtic movement, core values of the Celtic movement. The first one is engagement. The Celtic culture, and this gets translated into the spirituality, is a culture that is pretty much in motion. Now, a lot of our spiritual culture has been defined by contemplative, quiet, settling down, getting away, and there's that element in there too. There's certainly that's there. There's also this lively sense of we're going to get into it, okay? And I'd say that look for that piece of it and don't just think that we're getting into this meditative, quiet day, retreat kind of, that's very Benedictine, quiet day. Okay. Second is again from the culture, the idea of hospitality and honoring the visitor. And I'll get theologically why that's important in a bit. Okay, but this is common actually throughout the whole culture of the Bible, Middle Eastern culture, the culture of welcome, and in places where you're remote, when you come up against, when people are coming in, you open the doors and you welcome them. So this idea of welcoming and honoring is very front and center of Celtic core values. Then there's the appreciation of those on the margins or the fringes. Because the Celtic people were on the fringes and the margins. And so they've always appreciated that. And you saw in the little grace notes, look at the Book of Kells. This is the great Latane culture, Ireland, 11th century. You can go into the Book of Kells and see it at Trinity College in Dublin. This is the St. John's leaf, and if you look into the St. John's leaf, on the outside are all this beautiful work, and as you get closer and closer, you can see the Latine culture of all the little things in it. Great piece, little piece, okay? Appreciation of the fringes. I'd like to argue that deep in our DNA, in our Episcopal Anglican culture DNA, of this concern for people who are on the fringes, comes back to a lot of our Celtic roots. And there's a reason theologically for that as well, which I'll get to. And the last core value is the integration into daily life. A Celt would have no sense of, I'm going to go to church on Sunday. Everything was church. Every moment was contact. There's a sense where everything that happens is accompanied by a reminder that God is present in that action. Here is a prayer, for instance. I'll read it to you. This is the traditional prayer in Ireland for a woman who is kindling the fire in the morning. Think of that. You get up, make a fire in the morning. I will kindle my fire this morning in the presence of the holy angels of heaven. God, kindle thou in my heart, within a flame of love to my neighbor, to my foe, to my friend, to my kindred all. So there's the sense of everything that I'm doing, I'm going to remember the presence of Christ in that action. Okay? So it's a very immediate engagement with the world. And I think that's one thing that Esther Wall will bring out. Part of that engagement, of course, is the idea of mission. And there are many of the Celtic saints, especially the Irish saints, who are great missionaries. And the strength of the church was in going out with the good news, not to convert the heathen. And one of the things I've done a whole thing on Celtic mission, and I'll invite you one time when you're together to talk about Celtic mission. My sense of Celtic mission is very different than what you're hearing out there by your Baptist friends and everybody else. They want to go and convert the heathen. Go back and do any of the colonial stuff here. It's all the heathens, the pagans. We're going to make them like us. They're going to accept Christ. The Celts go out and they say, I'm not going to bring Christ. I'm going to meet Christ in people. Christ is already there. Who do I think I am? Christ is in nature. Christ is in people, whether they know it or not, in friend and foe alike. And I'm going to meet them there. And again, there's a reason for that theologically. But this great missionary kind of sense of the Celtic people grows out of this abundant claiming of God and Christ in the world about us. And not just in my little church. Maybe I do that very quickly at this point. Corinne, on college, you've heard this too many times, so I'll try it one more time with this group. Christians have 4 core beliefs that we have enshrined in the creeds. And all Christians primarily adopt one of them as a primary one that they lean to. Just like when we were born, in utero, before we were born, we were left-handed or right-handed. We were already born left-handed or right-handed. And you're going to favor that hand. Hopefully you're born with 2 feet and 2 hands. So Christianity has 4 basic beliefs. Okay? Resurrection, Easter. Okay? And that's the whole transformation. If you go into an Orthodox church, Greek, Russian, Syrian, you'll find the mysticism. And you have this great thing of transformation. And that's the hallmark of Easter resurrection faith. And we obviously love the resurrection, but that's not where, as Anglicans, that's not our primary theological prism we look at. The majority of Christians focus on the second great belief of the Christianity, the atonement, Good Friday. Christ died for us on the cross, and that before he saved us, we are saved. Okay. And as I said, the majority of Protestants, the majority of Catholics are into atonement theology, except a little differently. Catholics, it's always suffering. Jesus is hanging from the cross and suffering. going to the Catholic Church, big symbol there. Suffering for our sins. We're the responsible for that. And then you have the Protestant notion of, have I accepted that? Have I accepted my Lord in my life? And am I saved? And atonement Christians are always big on boundaries. Have you been saved? Can you come to communion? Are you part of the redeemed community? You see? And we look at that and we say, well, it doesn't feel so comfortable. We do Good Friday. We believe, but we're not going to be pounding the pulpit about St. Paul. How many times is Corinda preaching St. Paul? You can tell me that. Because St. Paul's all about atonement theology. Who's saved? I'm going to save everybody. And that can get, I think, a little overwhelming, especially when people are claiming that they are the only ones who have this wonderful thing. Everybody else is outside of it. And again, we don't like boundaries, like fuzzy boundaries. The third thing that we agree with Christians is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, Pentecost. That is, God is present in a powerful way, gifting us, bringing gifts to each of us. And then the people who lead with that are charismatics and Pentecostals. They can be charismatic Catholics or Episcopalians, but that's going to be their thing. They're going to be hands in the air, speaking in tongues, praising God. I'm gifted, we're gifted, what is your gift? All that stuff. And we believe in Pentecost, we believe in the Holy Spirit, but that's not the primary way we look at things. The fourth one is the doctrine of the Incarnation. Christmas. And that's where Anglicans live, that's our very heart. Different than Lutherans, I should say. Lutherans are still a mighty fortress of our God, and we have devils, and we have all that kind of stuff in their hymn. That's there. Anglicans are very, very much into this understanding of God among us. In the fourth gospel, there's this wonderful Palestinian idiom that doesn't translate well into our English. The narrator, the evangelist says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Do you remember that line? But that's not what the Greek says. It says, "The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us." That's the Semitic way of saying, in a culture of the Bible, he pitched his tent. He became one of us. You see, he dwelt with us. It's an idiom, okay? The idea of God in our midst, of Christ in our midst, and it comes from Celtic religion, because they believed that everything, like Native Americans, animism, everything had this spirit world. So we've got leprechauns, we've got little people, we've got gnomes and fairies. It's all Celtic stuff, okay? And it comes from this lively world where the world is this magical place. And the Spirit is everywhere. And the Celts come in and say, and Christ is everywhere. Okay? Yes?
So that's your theological reason for issuing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because we see Christ in everybody. Okay? They might not be Christian, but we can identify in the marks of God who created them, and the Christ who dwells in their heart. And we would like to share our understanding of that, but we're not going to go and say, we don't welcome you or honor you. It's a different way of looking at things. Okay? And that whole incarnational culture is totally part and parcel of who we are. And that's a piece I'm inviting you to look at when you open your prayer books up and when you hear our preachers preaching. You'll hear incarnational thinking all the time. And the extension of incarnational thinking is talking then about the basic human rights and values and human justice issues that are so frequently now forefront in our concern. Okay. I had to do it very quickly, but you get the sense of it, and you'll hear more of it as we go through. So the missionaries go out, and one of the places that Columba went, Columba is, just a slide here, I won't go back to it. Columba is a saint that follows Patrick by about 70 or 80 years. From Ireland, and he is a missionary, and he, with a group of 10 buddies get into a coracle. A coracle is a little tiny boat made of hides. And they go across the Irish Sea and they come to the Outer Hebrides, islands of what is now Scotland, off the Grand Island of Mull. Mull is just north of Islay. Islay is the island where all the Irish peaty Scotch is made. 8 distilleries in Islay. And it looks like it's spelled Islay. I-S-L-A-Y, but we pronounce it Islay. Mull is the island just above it, and above that is the island of Skye. Okay, Skye, it's the big one, the big island, the dark island. Mull is a long island, and on the tip of it is another island, a little island called Iona. And Iona is the place where the Irish missionaries went with St. Columba, and they founded a monastery there, and they took Christianity to Scotland. And from there, they converted, these are pictures you can't see of Iona that I took in one of my trips. This is actually a Benedictine monastery that was built in the 12th century and has now been restored by the Iona community. There's a community, an ecumenical community of Presbyterians, Catholics, and Anglicans called the Iona community. Very modern music, very social conscience, and it's a truly wonderful ecumenical way to try to come together as a Christian community. Columba went and preached to the Picts. The Picts were the native Neolithic peoples who survived in the highlands, and he went and preached and was successful in converting people to that. Now, meanwhile, in the south of England, I should say, the Roman Empire had gone away. Rome had retreated, the empire had collapsed, and so Christianity basically was sort of floating around, but not very organized in England. So what happens is this Celtic form of Christianity from the north comes down and starts to influence the Christianity. And meanwhile, the Pope has gotten St. Augustine, an Italian, to come to what is Canterbury and bring the Roman version of Christianity from the south and the surviving Celtic version of it coming back from the north. And these two things are coming together to form what we are now. Oswald is up in Northumberland, is baptized by Aidan. Aidan goes to Lindisfarne, and he founds on Lindisfarne, Holy Island, which is very similar to, took that picture, to Iona. So these two remote places, when both islands, the one, Iona you have to go by the ferry. You can't get there on a boat, or you can't get there on a road. Lindisfarne, you have to go at low tide. And Crindy, you weren't on that trip, but Robin was on that trip. We walked with the youth group at low tide on to Holy Island. It took us about an hour and 15 minutes to go through the bay. And we were up to our ankles and up to our knees in water. And of course, when the tide comes in, it's all, you can't get on anymore. It's an island. So it's a wonderful, beautiful, remote place. And it became the center and the soul of Christianity in England. So you have Scotland and England, what becomes them. They were not Scotland and England in those days. They were other countries, little countries. This was the country of Northumbria. Later on, the monastics came in. They built all these wonderful things. I will go through these. Another set of Gospels written here, like the Book of Kells. This is the Lindisfarne Gospel. And it also has the Latine art. You can see this at the British Museum. I just took a group last week to the new Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. We took a charter down there. And I saw leaves that they had from the Lindisfarne Gospels on display, on loan from the British Museum. It was really neat to see. This all dates from the 12th century. And just to run quickly through, there's wonderful people you might be reading in Esther de Wall, like St. Cuthbert. Cuthbert was one of the greatest of the English revered saints. Buried in Durham Cathedral, Celtic saint from Lindisfarne, inheritor of the tradition of Columba and then Aidan, and he becomes this great, wonderful missionary presence in Northumbria. even today, you can go and start, if you are a hiker, you can start at Melrose Abbey. Melrose is in the lower border section of Scotland. And you can follow a 51-mile trail to Lindisfarne, over the hills and dales, and it's called the Cuthbert Trail. And this is the Cuthbert Cross, one of the crosses that is identified with British Christianity. You'll see sometimes that distinctive cross. We're more familiar, of course, with what's happening in Canterbury. That, of course, that's the Gothic Cathedral, and we know about Canterbury. And as I say, that becomes the place where the Roman Christianity from the Pope comes. And St. Augustine is sent there. He comes to Kent. He establishes a presence of Christianity back in England. And eventually it becomes the headquarters of the Church of England, Canterbury. And the Canterbury cross is a cross that is very distinctive, that you also might see from time to time. When you see that, you know you're in the midst of Anglicans. Of course, we're thinking about the high crosses, and you can't see a picture. That high cross is painted. The crosses we see now are all washed away, and originally they were all painted. The Celts loved vivid colors. So all these things were highly painted. And here's a recreation of a cross in Ireland where it's all painted. The stone is painted in colors. To just finish the historical saga, and then a couple comments about the theology of all of this. There comes a moment when finally the Celtic movement, Christianity, and the Roman movement, Christianity, come together and collide, and there were differences. And they settled those differences at a wonderful remote place called Whitby. I've been to Whitby. It's a lovely vista on the eastern side of England, right on the coast. Very fishing. There's great seafood comes in there. Great fish and chips. Especially the Magpie restaurant. I recognize it. Anyway, it was here that a woman, Helda, Saint Helda, is in charge. She's the abbess of this group, because Celtic peoples, women held places of importance as well. People are surprised to hear that. In the whole run-up to the ordination of women, one of the things that people appealed to was this Celtic tradition or history. People didn't know much about it. Women had places of prominence. And bishops were not administrators. Bishops were missionaries. You had an abbot to do the administration. I wish we'd get back to having bishops as missionaries and not as administrators, but that's the way we have it. Our bishops are sort of CEOs as well as missionaries. Anyway, Hilda was the one. It took a woman to get these two knuckleheads together, and they finally, at Whitby, put it all together, and the Celts accepted most of the aspects of the Roman Christianity. The big issue there was haircuts. Celtic monks have long hair in the back, and the front was all shaved. The Roman monks had a tonsure all around here shaved, and there was hair around like a halo. And they were all upset because they had different hairstyles. So they were also upset about different times when they celebrated Easter. So they finally got the same date for Easter, they got the same haircuts, and they sort of got together. But I think you'll see that a lot of the Celtic things made their way into Christianity in England, Scotland, and eventually into the Church of England, and eventually into the Episcopal Church, the threads that run through it. Oh, yeah. We think of Rome, there's the Vatican, but the center of Christianity is not necessarily just in the Vatican. There's a stark contrast to the Vatican with all of its majesty and history and structure and the sense, the Celtic sense, which is very different. Okay, I'll finish with now the theological core values. It's the centrality of incarnation. Okay, you all know the wonderful hymn that we sing, I bind unto myself today, the Irish hymn. I bind unto myself today. Very Irish, in minor key, okay? But then it moves to major key. Christ be with me, Christ above me, Christ behind me, Christ beside me, da, 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 you know? And it's incarnation. Christ here, here by me, in foe, friend and stranger. Remember those lines? Yeah, yeah. Incarnational. Okay, that's what it is. Okay. So this idea of incarnation is also reverence for the world. And so this whole of ecology we're also into right now. Presiding bishop is talking about sustainability, ecology. That's a very Celtic thing. Trinity, the idea of relationships and connectiveness. Because you think of Trinity, it's not just that symbol, it's how everything relates. So, to my congregation, I'm Father Mark. To my wife, I'm Mark. To my kids, I'm Dad. To my friends, you see, I'm the same person, but experienced in different ways. We experience God in different ways in three persons. And it's all connected in relationship. So this connectiveness in Celtic thinking. The saints, the affirmation of ancestors. Huge. Celtic saints, not this Roman thing, you have to have miracles to be a saint. There are thousands of Celtic saints by tradition. And we have taken over that tradition when we get to All Saints. Sing the song of the saints of God, and I mean to be one too. The saints are not somebody that the Pope has said has miracles. You can pray to them, they'll have a miracle for you. The saints are people like you and me. That's Celtic. See? It's Celtic. It's not Roman, it's Celtic. St. Patrick's statue. Oh, that's Croagh-Patrick. We climbed Croagh-Patrick. Remember Croagh-Patrick? Yeah, you remember that? Yeah. That was about 5 hours of hard climbing with the youth group to get to the top. That's the Holy Mountain of Ireland. And it's a great, great, wonderful place. You can find all kinds of things. Here's the Celtic Psalms. I have a little slide about Celtic traditions. I talked about Christmas. Christmas is our thing. So many of the Celtic things that we do, like wreaths and trees and fairies and mistletoe, and it all comes in part from some Celtic, some Germanic traditions that come together, and many of them are quite old. And it stands in some contrast. We think of Christmas as King's College and Cambridge and once in Royal David's City and all this British kind of Christianity stuff. But beneath it all, look at the hymns, look at the words. You'll find a lot of Celtic things that come into the Christmas traditions. I mentioned the hymn of St. Patrick. It's called in Gaelic the Lorica. I bind it to myself today. It's also called the breastplate. And there's this wonderful line in there about the stable earth, the deep salt sea, and round the old eternal rocks. Remember that?
Yes.
You can see the rocks of Ireland. You can see what's the hymn? The hymn is saying we see Christ in all these places. Right? The stable earth, the deep salt sea, around the eternal rocks, and then of course there's the high crosses as other symbols. And the Celtic saints, I've talked about them. And that brings me to the end. No, not quite to the end. There's the coracle. Old Irish saying, "Oh, the Lord, the world is so, your sea is so large and my boat is so small." And the idea that we go into the boat with Christ, prepared to meet Christ along the way, this idea of mission. So, a Celtic twilight, and I invite you into this time. I hope that it will be a wonderful, refreshing time. I'm going to suggest that as you come together, you might take from David Adams' book, you're going to know about this. There are 4 services for each day of the week. Each day has a theme. And you could take the noonday service whenever you gather and read it for 3 or 4 minutes and have Celtic themes in it. And the themes are all different. Sunday is resurrection, Monday is creation, Tuesday is incarnation, Wednesday is Holy Spirit, Thursday is community, connectedness, Friday is cross, Saturday are the saints and ancestors. All Celtic themes. And marvelous prayers in here. I met David Adam, who was our vicar of Moonves Farm. Wonderful man, a lot of books he's written. So I recommend that you might start with that. And then you'll have your readings, and I think we passed out what you're going to be reading for each week. Okay? And if any of you would like to contact me, I'm certainly happy to converse on the phone or an email. If you have a question, like to follow up with something, I'd be happy to do that, but it's a little too far for me to drive all the time and be here with you. But I'm happy to be with you today, and I do wish you God's peace and grace. These are the rocks. Here is the Celtic knot. And this is a rock from Iona, and this is from Lindisfarne. So these are my watchstones of the Celtic tradition. Can I answer any questions?
An obscure one. You said Patrick was born in 271 to a Christian family. What does that say about the presence of the church? I mean, I've read a little bit about this in England at that time.
Right. Well, the Roman Empire left, and with it came a lot of the protections that they had enjoyed. There was Hadrian's Wall that separated Scotland from England, and the whole Roman system of authority had broken down. It had gone back into a tribal authority kind of a situation, but Christianity did survive in places, certainly survived. And we believe that Patrick was probably born in the north of England, or maybe even up towards Wales or Scotland.
I was thinking of the tradition that Joseph of Arimathea brought.
Oh, it's a lovely
Christianity.
That's a lovely tradition. Yeah, that's a great. The tradition that Joseph came to
That's Bath and Wells.
yeah, it's Bath and Wales, and
Wells.
what's the matter? I'm freezing on the name now. He planted a staff, and
Staff.
it became the thorn bush. Lo how rose are blooming.
Yeah,
Everything. It's a lovely tradition because
the monastery
every year.
where Arthur was buried.
Yeah, it's the Arthurian legend too. Every year they take a sprig of the tree, the thorn bush, Glastonbury, thank you. They take a sprig from the rose bush at Glastonbury and they take it to Sandringham, which is where the queen is at that time, and it's always by tradition on her table decorating the queen's or the king's table from Glastonbury. Very sad, 6-7 years ago some vandals came in the week before and they cut the tree down. But the nice thing of it is because of our horticulture, we've taken all these samplings and they were able to take a sampling and replant it, and a new thorn bush has come up. But that's the Joseph of Arimathea, and I wrote about that this summer on his feast days the end of July. Remember I talked about tin mining going on in Cornwall? Cornwall is very close to Glastonbury. Okay.
I now know that that's where some of my ancestors.
Okay. So there's many things that come from ancient writings that Joseph left because he had interests in the tin industry, and that's why he came to that region. It's obviously a legend, but it's one cherished by English peoples. They took his staff, planted it in the ground, and the staff sprung up as the rose tree. And so that's the tradition.
So I have a question just about the Germans. If you're 47% Welsh and that leaves, you're 47% German. I'm over half, I think.
Right.
So I always heard that the Germanic tribes came across the area, I guess this is now Poland, Germany, and went all the way to the far reaches of the Atlantic, and that they became the Celts?
Well, they overtook the language, the Teutonic languages overcame, and the Celtic languages faded.
But they weren't the same stock originally, or are they going to be
Well,
found out to be all the same?
Well, they will intermarry, and here's an example of intermarriage. Also, the Vikings come from Scandinavia.
Right.
Okay, now it's a fact scientifically we have more redhead people in Ireland than any country in Europe. But also genetically, they've now traced this back. Red hair is not Celtic.
Viking.
Red hair is Viking. It's these Viking guys that came in and pillaged and raped. And that's where the red hair came from. And all of us have those kind of strains within us, and that's what it gets